This lesson is for section 2.4, chemical reactions. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to predict what happens during a chemical reaction and identify clues that a chemical change has occurred. Let's take some notes on that first learning goal. Be able to predict what happens during a chemical reaction. A chemical change is also called a chemical reaction. One or more substances change into new substances. Two vocabulary words you should know are reactants and products. The reactants are the substances present before a chemical reaction occurs. The products are the substances present after a chemical reaction occurs. Right here you see the general setup for a chemical equation. It's called an equation even though it uses an arrow instead of an equal symbol. A chemical reaction begins with substances that are reactants, and they change into substances that are products. The second learning goal is to be able to identify clues that a chemical reaction has occurred. What is it that you might observe that would let you know that new products have been created? Here are some observations that might mean a new substance has formed. Just because you see these things doesn't guarantee a chemical reaction has happened. There could have been a physical change that has happened, where properties change, but the actual substances themselves have not changed. Our first clue is that energy in the form of heat or light has been used or released. For example, maybe a temperature change occurs. A substance might get colder or hotter. Or perhaps you see light produced. That light could be in the form of a flame. A second clue, a substance has changed color. Perhaps to begin with you have a clear liquid, but then something happens and it turns orange. A third clue is a gas is produced. Maybe you'll notice little bubbles form in a liquid, or vapor being released from the surface of the liquid and floating off into the air. A fourth clue is a precipitate is formed from solutions. A precipitate is a solid that forms within liquids, and then over time that solid would settle to the bottom of the container. Next, let's take a look at some video of some interesting chemical reactions. Next, I'm going to pause the video for a few minutes for you to answer these check for understanding questions. Then we'll have a quick discussion about them before we get back to the video. The final concept discussed in this lesson is the law of conservation of mass. During a chemical reaction, the mass of the products is equal to the mass of the reactants. Let's make sense of that law by looking at this question. 5 grams of carbon are reacted with 13.32 grams of oxygen to produce a product called carbon dioxide. How many grams of that product, carbon dioxide, are produced? The law of conservation of mass says that the mass of the reactants is equal to the mass of the products. Well, what are the reactants? The reactants are the carbon and the oxygen. The mass of the reactants are 5 grams plus 13.32 grams. If we add those values together, that will be the total mass of the reactants, which will be equal to how much carbon dioxide is produced. So 5 plus 13.32 is 18.32 grams. This concludes this introductory lesson about chemical reactions. We'll study chemical reactions in greater detail later this year.